little bit about some of our upcoming programs in the end of October, November, and December. Later this week, on Thursday evening, we're hosting author Stephen Pfeiffer, who will be presenting a lecture on his latest book, The Eagle and the Trident, which is about the past, present, and imagined future of U.S.-Ukraine relations. If you still have a lecture pass to use before the end of the year, we recommend you join us on Thursday for that event. Next Thursday, on October 26th, we'll be joined by Malcolm Nance, a career counterterrorism and intelligence officer for the U.S. government's Special Operations, Homeland Security, and intelligence agencies. Mr. Nance makes frequent appearances as a breaking news analyst for NBC News, both regarding terrorism and the Trump-Russia investigations. He will talk about his book, The Plot to Hack America, How Putin's Cyber Spies and WikiLeaks Tried to Steal the 2016 Election. Next month, on November 13th, we'll be over at the Penn Museum for an event featuring Wendy Perlman, a Middle East expert and award-winning professor and author of We Crossed a Bridge and It Trembled, Voices from Syria. Guests at this event will have exclusive access to the museum's Cultures in the Crossfires exhibition, as the museum is generally closed on Mondays, but will be open to program attendees for private viewing with a museum curator. Finally, on December 13th, we'll be hosting the American Healthcare Debate, What's Next? A discussion about, you guessed it, healthcare. We'll be joined by a panel of experts, including Dr. Stephen Klasko, who's CEO of Thomas Jefferson University, Mr. Dan Hilferty, who's the CEO of Independence Blue Cross, Ms. Suzanne Garber, chair of the board and co-founder of GAUS and an adjunct professor at Temple University, and Ms. Emily G., a health economist of health policy at the Center for American Progress. And now to tonight's program. I'd like to welcome our three panelists. Marissa Boyers-Bluestine has been the Pennsylvania Innocence Project's legal director since its inception in 2009. She coordinates and supervises the legal efforts of the organization. Marissa also promotes their mission through public education, advocacy, and legislative reform for issues and laws related to innocence and the criminal justice system. She's joined by Mr. Kenneth Granger, a client of the PA Innocence Project, who spent 28 years in prison for a murder committed by another man. He always maintained his innocence, and on July 14th, 2020, finally released. We are most grateful to Mr. Granger, who is here tonight to talk about the story. Finally, we also welcome the Honorable Theodore McKee, a United States Circuit Judge of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit. He previously served on the Philadelphia Court of Common Pleas in the First District of Pennsylvania. We'll have the opportunity to hear from each of our speakers, who will have about 15 or 20 minutes, and then we'll be accepting questions from you, the audience, for the last 20 minutes or so of the program. So please join me in welcoming our speakers.
Thank you so much, Haley, and thank you everybody for coming out to this program. As Haley said, my name is Marissa Bluestine. I am the executive director at the Innocence Project. Do I just give this for Nancy?
No, sorry, give it one.
Okay, so through this together, so you're going to have to apologize if I look back, because there's like numbers up here and stuff that I wanted to do. So what I think, and Stan will correct me if I'm wrong, is I will kind of give a very brief overview about what convictions, about what they are, about how they happen, and what organizations like ours, what we do in order to try to correct those injustices for the individuals convicted. Kenneth will graciously share some of his story, and I'll introduce a little bit about what he suffered through, what he went through. And Judge McKee has been very instrumental in trying to have a decisions as a Third Circuit judge, and has an innovative, or the only one in the country, I think, so far, to specifically address eyewitness identification, as we'll see, a leading cause of convicting the actual innocent. So when we talk about innocence in cases or exonerations, you may hear the word exonerated or exonerated. We actually have a very specific definition that we kind of use. There are about 67 organizations like mine around the world. So that I do. We are the Pennsylvania Innocence Project. We're here in Pennsylvania. There's an Innocence Project in New York, which is very well known, run by lawyers Barry Scheck and Peter Neufeld, connected to them directly. But we do similar work here in Pennsylvania as they do nationally. Their organization works in cases involving DNA. Our organization, most of our clients don't have the possibility of DNA evidence proving their innocence, like Mr. Granger, about a percentage of our cases do. So it's actually a little bit different. So when we're talking about what is an exoneration, we have kind of a common definition that an exoneration occurs when a person who has been convicted of a crime is officially cleared based on new evidence of innocence. Okay, so this is a definition which has been developed by a program called the National Registry of Exonerations, an organization that tracks these cases through. So this is kind of the working definition that we have. To give you an idea of exonerations nationwide, to date 351 people have been exonerated using DNA evidence. So those are 351 individuals we know to a moral certainty did not commit the crime for which they were convicted because DNA evidence later showed that they were innocent. And of those 351, we've identified about 150 true perpetrators who then went on to commit 80 sexual assaults and about 60 additional murders. So it's not just a matter of the human tragedy of a person who's innocent serving time in prison for no reason. There is actually a public safety aspect to these as well. But in addition to the 351, this number is actually wrong, there's been over 2,100 exonerations since 1989. So those include the DNA exonerations, but also what we call the non-DNA exonerations. So those are cases where we're able to prove innocence through some means other than using DNA. In addition to those, there are about 2,500 what we call group exonerations. We don't include those in the actual number because those are cases where the convictions have been withdrawn for a variety of reasons, predominantly, frankly, because of police misconduct. Anyone want to guess the leading jurisdiction? Philadelphia? Yeah. Philadelphia. Yeah, we account for about 800 of those. Yeah. We'll just move on. The statistic the best statistic I have in terms of how many people are convicted a year of a crime they did not commit is about 10,000. This was actually just reaffirmed in a very recent social study, I think about 2 months ago it was released. And that's 10,000 people convicted of serious crimes. So we're not talking about drug possession or prostitution or DUI. We're talking about murders or rapes or robberies or burglaries. Crimes that carry very significant sentences, often life in prison, sometimes without the possibility of death penalty as well. So this is the best estimate we have throughout the United States. So when there are what we call exonerations in real time, so exonerations that happen during a calendar year. There are also exonerations that we kind of capture that have happened years before. We're just finding out about it now. There are thousands of jurisdictions across the country. There's just thousands. And there's really no way to track the cases in any scientifically valid way. The best that we can have is people report the cases to the exoneration registry, which frankly is only about 4 or 5 years old, and then tell them about the case so we can start to keep track. So there's really no way to know how many people have been exonerated in the United States. There just isn't. The best thing we can do is try to find those cases out historically and then track them as we go forward. So last year, in 2016, there were 166 exonerations that year. That doesn't mean that those individuals were convicted in that year and then cleared that year. They include people like my client Dante Rollins, who was convicted 10 years before, but then was finally exonerated on December 27, 2016. So that's kind of what we mean by real-time exonerations. So when we track that information, I don't know if you can actually see these numbers. So there was a record number of exonerations last year, 166. So that's more than 2 a week. Of those, 24 of them had been exonerated of they were convicted of sexual crimes that either did not occur or who another perpetrator committed. 54 were exonerated for some form of homicide, either for murder, 2 for manslaughter. 73 were convicted of, exonerated, of nonviolent crimes. The most of those, or about 60 of those, were out of Dallas, Texas. It was a group of individuals who had been exonerated in drug cases. There was a group of police officers who were involved in fabricating evidence. I know it sounds like I'm on a conspiracy trip here, but these are real cases, and this really did happen. So about 60 people were framed for crimes that they absolutely did not commit. They were not involved in the drugs. They had nothing to do with it. They didn't have it on them, but they were kind of swept up in a lot of these cases involving the Dallas Police Department. And then there were 15 exonerations for other violent crimes, such as robberies or burglaries as well. One of the astonishing things we've seen over the last few years is the increased number of exonerations in people who had pled guilty originally. So if you don't know, about 95% of the cases in the United States are disposed of by guilty plea. They don't go to trial at all. And so you're talking about the vast majority of people who are charged with crimes will eventually plead guilty to them. In last year, we were able to exonerate 74 people who had pled guilty, but were actually innocent. So they will plead guilty knowing they did not commit the crime, but for whatever reason, they decide that pleading guilty is in their best interest and they want to move forward with that. 57 of those were drug cases, 6 were homicides, 4 were homicides that included a false confession, and 3 of those were for child sex abuse cases. Again, these are 74 people who were exonerated even though they had pled guilty to the crime. Last year, there were also 94 people exonerated where no crime had occurred. Okay, no crime had occurred, and yet they were convicted of it. Again, 59 of those were the cases out of Texas involving drug possessions, but there were 35 other types of crimes. That could be an arson, right? Somebody who gets convicted of intentionally setting fire to a home or somewhere else where somebody is injured, and in fact, the fire was not arson, it was not intentionally set, it was an accident. So you have somebody who's doing time in prison for something that wasn't even a crime. An example of that is my client, Terry Smallwood. She served 43 years in prison, having been convicted of an arson. Not only was she nowhere near the property when it happened, it was not an intentionally set fire. It was just an accidental fire caused by an overload on electrical outlet. So that reports for 94 of the cases from last year. And I'm sure you can't read that one, but it says, last year there were 70 of the exonerations involved official misconduct was a contributing factor. And usually that is police or prosecutors withholding evidence that they're supposed to turn over. Sadly, once in a while it involves a judge intentionally making rulings that they know to be incorrect in order to push the conviction where they want it to go. But again, that's almost half of the exonerations involve some form of official misconduct. When we look, every time we have an exoneration, we try to pull the case apart a bit to kind of look at what happened, right? How is it that we managed to convict somebody who had nothing to do with the crime? And we find that it falls into a lot of different categories. So for example, for 80% of the cases involving a wrongful sexual assault conviction, an eyewitness or victim misidentified the defendant. And I don't want to create the impression that that statistic means that 80% of sexual assault victims misidentify their attacker. That's not what that's saying at all. What that's saying is that where there's somebody who is convicted of a sexual assault crime that they did not commit, 80% of those convictions involve an eyewitness getting it wrong. 51% of all exonerations involve some form of perjury or false informant testimony. 42% again involve some form of official misconduct, as I mentioned. 25% of those who are wrongfully convicted of homicide gave false confessions. And these are confessions, not just kind of, okay, fine, I did it, can I get out of here, but detailed confessions about a crime they know nothing about because they weren't there. And that's for 25% of the people who are convicted of a homicide they did not commit, they actually entered a false confession. And then 24% of all exonerations involve some form of falsified or faulty forensic evidence. Could be a comparison to a tire mark or a shoe print or a footprint. Even, sadly, DNA cases have been involved in exonerations. I have a few fun slides on my list there. Do you want me to cover these?
Go ahead.
So I just wanted to, just because I think so many people don't really understand about eyewitness error and how it is that people can see something and yet get it wrong, right? I just want to take a couple minutes to kind of run through a little bit about it. I tried cases for over 10 years at the Philadelphia Defender Association, and I tried hundreds of cases involved eyewitnesses. And when an eyewitness gets on the stand and looks at the defendant and says, that's the man who, that is incredibly impactful evidence for a jury to hear. Because most of the time, because the juror would think, well, if I was in that position, I would remember that face, I wouldn't get it wrong. And the juror and the witness almost always says something like, I'll never forget that face. I see his face in my nightmares. And they mean it literally. They're not lying, they're just mistaken, or they can be mistaken. For one thing, we tend to think of human memory, like a video camera. And not granted, this probably should be like an iPhone 6 or just stay with me. Right? So we tend to think that your memory is kind of like a video camera. Like we capture things accurately, we can replay it at any time. Maybe it fades out over time, but you can accurately replay it over and over and over again. That's actually not true. Your memory is it's reconstituted from a lot of different events and different experiences that you have. It could be something you've seen, it could be a picture, it could be something you've heard, it could be something somebody else said. So when your memory is trying to recreate something, it's pulling from all different parts of your brain. The other aspect about memory that people don't really understand is that it can be contaminated. As a memory is sitting in somebody's brain, kind of bouncing around among the neurons, if you get false information, it can literally change your memory. So it's not that your memory is like a video camera, it's more like a Wikipedia page. And the editor's kind of out to lunch and not paying attention. Because once that page gets changed, it's not going back. You can't recreate that memory when you first had it. So our memories for faces is actually fairly unreliable. It takes about 7 or 8 examples of seeing somebody in person to be able to kind of really recognize them later. Your memory, as I said, is extremely malleable. The traditional lineup methods we use force people into kind of this false choice, almost like a weird multiple choice test. And if the true perpetrator is not present, then the person who most resembles that perpetrator is most likely to be picked. Then eyewitness confidence, if it grows over time, in other words, if at the time of the identification they say, well, maybe that's him, I'm not quite sure, and then by the time they get to trial, it's, oh, that's his face, I'll never forget it. Something happened in between those two events, because your memory does not get better. I don't care how much ginkgo biloba or whatever else you take, your memory is not getting better. It only decreases over time. So if you've got somebody who's somewhat certain at an ID and then they're positive at trial, something happened to contaminate that memory in between. So we know that things like lineup composition, how the lineup itself is composed, really can make a difference. So, if somebody stands out, they're more likely to get picked. Okay. We also know that of a phenomenon that's called photo commitment effect. Remember I said that your memory can actually change. So this is a photo of an actual lineup from Georgia. A gentleman named John White had been arrested and was put in this live line. It was a rape of a woman. Honestly, I used to say she was elderly, but now that I'm 50 and she's 70, she's young. Very young, spry. So she was raped in her home. She's Caucasian, the perpetrator's African American. A few days after the incident, she was brought down to the police station to view a photo array. She picked out John White's photo array. I can't tell you why John's photo was in there. It's not that I don't want to, I just don't know. She picked it up, but she was kind of tentative about it. She said, I think that's it. So they brought her to the police station a few days later, and they did this live lineup with her. And this is a lineup very much like you've seen on Law & Order, where you've got your suspect of your crime, and then the other guys are like in the drunk tank, right? They're kind of sleeping it off, and they have to throw them in the line. Thinking back to my little lineup with the peeps, right? Everybody stand out to you? How about the guy in the middle who looks like he's in on the prostitution charge, right? And he's like, can I just go back to work now? Right? He's the only wearing a white t-shirt. He's the only one in shorts. That is, in fact, John White. And he was identified by the victim. He went to trial. He was convicted. Based on her testimony and the testimony of a hair analyst who said that hairs found at the crime scene matched John and, quote, no one else on the planet. That testimony was not quite correct, as I'm sure you can guess. Otherwise, I probably would not have this slide up here. Right? John was exonerated through DNA evidence, but it didn't just exonerate John, it identified the true perpetrator. Oh, wow. That guy. His name is James Pornham. He was in the lineup with him. James was in the district that day because he'd been stopped on a DUI. That's the man who raped her. She's standing right in front of him in good light, and not only does she not see him, she identifies somebody in almost every way completely different from Mr. Farmer. But that's what we call the mugshot commitment effect. What we think happened is because she saw John's mugshot, it changed the memory in her head, so that when the true perpetrator is standing right in front of her, she doesn't even see him, and she only identifies John. Once in a while, we see cases involving composite sketches, and if you were to ask a social scientist, how do we improve composite sketch, you'll get one answer: don't use them. Because when you're doing composite sketches, you're actually impacting the witness's memory as it's being created. And it's not like there's an artist that runs from police district to police district, right? They set the witness down in front of a computer and they use a program usually called Identikit. And they'll pull up like 52 noses and say, okay, pick the nose. And then they'll pick the eyes and pick the mouth. And it's kind of this weird jigsaw puzzle that you're kind of putting together. But there are problems with the way these things happen. This is one. These are 9 sketches of the same individual. Okay, this is a case out of San Francisco. He'd been identified as the teardrop rapist. 9 different victims, and it's only 2 years that separates the attacks. You know, you can't tell, you know, his ethnicity, his age, how many teardrops, which side of the face, right? So, I mean, that's one problem. But that's another one. I'll just leave that there for a second. Right? I mean, I was kind of wondering what the cameraman was doing. Like, you know, I'm getting that reward, man. And he had a pretty good alibi. He was doing a live broadcast at the time of the assault. Okay. But that's the other problem, is that, you know, people who are completely innocent can resemble a composite sketch. And on the serious side, heaven forbid the victim saw this. Because if she did, it's quite possible that she may have, you know, transposed the memory of this very innocent, very nice anchorman from Atlanta with the person who actually committed the rape. So that's a little bit of a lead up for Judge McKee. So as far as our organization is concerned, our mission is to identify people who are convicted of crimes they did not commit, and then work to exonerate them and prevent innocent people from being convicted. And I just wanted to kind of pull up, there he is, Mr. Granger here, looking so handsome. I love that picture. So we've been in operation since 2009. Kenneth was our first client that we had the great privilege of representing. And since then, we've represented 10 other individuals, been able to walk them out of prison. I haven't actually done the math because I suck at math, but it's around 270 years combined our clients have served, including, as I mentioned, my client Terry, she served 43 years. My client Jim served 34. The lowest was Dante, who served 10. And these are years, obviously, that they'll never get back, that their families will never get back. And you've taken away, for the most part, the best part of their lives, the most productive part of their lives. And then when they get out, they get nothing. Nothing. We don't compensate people who are wrongly convicted in the state. As I say, the 401k plan in prison is really pretty bad. They're not there. They're not contributing to Social Security. There's no retirement plan when they come out. We have nothing. And we have to help them start all over again. And it's tragedy, and it's wrong. It's just morally wrong that we take this time away from these individuals and give them nothing to start over. Our organization does that because we feel a moral obligation to do that. But we're very limited in what we can do, as I'm sure Kenneth will complain about in just a second. But Kenneth was convicted of participating in a murder that had happened in a bar in West Philadelphia, if I'm not mistaken. He was home with his family. Thank you, North Philadelphia. He was home with his family, like any other night, and he winds up getting convicted of this. Kenneth fought for years and years and years on his own to clear this, to clear his name. Eventually, the prosecution wound up having to hand over their file to Kenneth's lawyers through a very quirky ruling by a judge. In the file, there were 2 photo rays, including Kenneth, that one of the witnesses who was at the bar that night was shown. That witness never testified at trial. She identified somebody other than Kenneth. That information had never been turned over to defense counsel. And then when we asked the district attorney about it, they said, oh, that was another robbery on the same night of the same bar, and being investigated by the same detective with the same victims. No, it wasn't. You should have turned this over, and you didn't. At that point, the district attorney's office came to Kenneth and said, okay, fine, you'll win this, we can appeal it, you'll stay in Great Effort Prison for another 3 or 4 years, or you can walk out tomorrow. And at first they wanted him to plead guilty to it. If you plead guilty to a lesser degree of homicide, and then finally they agreed to let him plead what we call no contest or enter an Alford plea, insisting that he's still innocent, which he is, but at least allowed him to be able to leave prison and be with his family, which I think is an untenable decision to have to make. And I remember when Kenneth was really grappling with that. But it's a decision that is forced upon people all across the country all the time. Either extend your time in prison, or you can get out tomorrow if you plead to this and be able to walk out of the prison. But I've known Kenneth since 2009, I think, when I was visiting you up in Randolph. And I can tell you that for me personally, he's just an inspiration for me. He's just a tremendously humble man. I know being here to talk about himself is not easy for him. But Kenneth Bridge.
Good evening. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you for the introduction, Marissa. Thank y'all for inviting me here. This is like a dream. I could never believe that I would be in a place like this. I don't know where to begin because Marissa covered every aspect about the criminal justice system. I really don't know where to begin at, other than to tell you, she done told you a brief synopsis of what occurred with me. So what I want to do is try to give you some type of idea. I'm looking out into the audience and I see a lot of young faces, some in their 20s, early 30s. And that's how old I was when they arrested me. And at the time, I had a lot of goals that I wanted to achieve. And I was going to school for PC board training, printed circuit boards. I was going to work at RCA out in Valley Forge on the assembly line. And so I was doing good in school. And I wasn't thinking about committing no crimes. I had a child to support, so my mind was, to become a family man and do what I had to do. And I came home one March night, not thinking about anything, just thinking about, wow, I had a good day at school, and a knock came at the door. And I was in there playing with my daughter, we watching TV. My daughter's mother answered the door, and I heard someone say, is it Kenneth Granger here? So my daughter's mother called me, Kenny, somebody wants you at the door. I put the baby on the bed and went to walk towards the front door, and they burst in. It was 2 detectives. And one had his gun drawn. He pointed the gun like this, was waving it, don't move, and it just caused sheer panic. You know what I mean? Because we didn't know what was going on. I'm trying to say, officer, what's going on? What's the matter? What's going on? Trying to calm everything down. While I'm talking to this one, the other one is searching the house. So going through the closet. See, we have a report that you have a gun in here. So there's no gun in the house. They're still searching. So the officer that was in front of me, these were 2 detectives, mind you, not police, they were 2 detectives. He said, listen, let me talk to you for a minute. Pull me to the side, because he saw the hysteria that they were creating within the house. Baby was crying, baby mother, she's screaming. So, all right, y'all just calm down, let me talk to him for a minute. So they said, well, listen, where were you tonight? I said, I just came from school. I said, well, we have a report to arrest you. I said, arrest me for what? He said, listen, I don't know, man. Come down to the police district. If you're clear, we'll let you go. Simple as that. African-American detective. Caucasian detective searching the house. Let me be clear about this. So we get there, I said, all right. I want everything to calm down. So, get my family, put my family in safety. I said, well, let me speak to my daughter's mother. Took her in the kitchen. I said, look, I don't know what's going on. I'm going to go down to the police district with them. It's about 9 o'clock. I should be back by 10, no later than 10:30. And I said, well, can I put on my jacket? He said, yeah, go ahead, put your jacket on. They didn't handcuff me or nothing. Put me in the car. Took me on the highway, and then they pulled off to an off-ramp. So when they pull off to the off-ramp, they cut the light out, cut the engine off. And one detective was sitting next to me, the other one's driving. So I'm sitting there and I'm shaking like a leaf. I don't know what's going on. I don't know if they're going to shoot me and dump me in the bushes right here. I don't know what's going on. And we sit there for maybe about 15 minutes listening to the police radio. And finally something over the police radio, wagon. Police wagon pulled up. And he got out, the detective got out, and they went to go talk about something. I heard him say, you want me to transport him to the police district? He said, no, take him to PAB, right, Police Administration Building, A for race. So, of course I'm crying out, I'm hysterical, I'm scared to death. I don't know what's going on, you know what I mean? To be honest with you, 23 years old, very scared, you know. At that time they handcuffed me, put me in a wagon, and took me to A for race. So, like Marissa said, you know, when you're inside the interrogation unit, it's a different world. And all you're thinking about is, I want to get out, to go home to my family. I know I didn't do nothing wrong, so if I tell the truth, I should be out of here sooner than later. Tell the truth, and you'll be out of here sooner than later. So he said, well, listen, we're going to ask you a couple of questions. And where were you on a certain night 5 months ago? I said, 5 months ago? He said, yeah. Now, mind you, I'm scared to death, but I'm trying to think, but I can't think straight because I'm scared. You know what I mean? So I said, 5 months ago? I said, I was at a party. I know I was at a family's party. He said, you sure? I said, yeah, I was at a family's party. So he said, about what time did you get there? What time did you leave? And I answered these questions. And the whole time, what he was doing really was building the case against me. He was fabricating it to fit the charges because they didn't have no evidence. And I didn't know that, you know. So he said, well, look, between me and you, I don't think you did it. He said, but it's up to the DA's office. He said, I'm going to make a phone call and see what's up. You know what I mean? They said, let you go, let you go. I said, all right. So I'm sitting there, another detective come in and say, how you doing, Mr. Granger? I said, I'm all right. A little tired. By this time, it's like 12:30, 1 o'clock. They arrested me about maybe 10 o'clock, 10 p.m. that night. By this time, it's about 1:30. And he said, you hungry? You want a sandwich? You want a cup of coffee or something? I said, I don't care. You know, he said, do you want, he said, look, how would you feel about taking a polygraph? You know, it won't hurt. I said, sure, I'll take polygraph, truth serum, hypnotism, whatever you want. Whatever you want, because I know I'm telling the truth. You know what I mean? I know that I did not commit a crime. I knew it for a fact. You know, so he said, all right. So they brought this lady officer in. She took me in another room, put the machine on me. They asked me the questions. They got the results. They brought me back into the other room. And they said, the thing came back inconclusive. So now I'm looking at it like, wait a minute. You asked me a direct question. I give you a direct answer. You say in the machine, say, I don't know. You know, I don't know. You know, he said, well, did you drink anything or drugs? I said, no, what are you talking about? You telling me this machine is saying, I don't know? Either I'm lying or I'm telling the truth. It's not saying I don't know. It don't make sense. You know what I mean? He said, well, how would you like to get on another machine, a little more sensitive? You know? I said, I don't care, whatever you bring in here, just bring it. I don't care, I gotta go to school tomorrow, man. That's all I'm thinking about. You know what I mean? And so they put me on another machine, same results came out. Inconclusive, so they say. You know what I mean? So he said, well, listen, with these two results, I'm gonna call the DA. And, because it's not my call, it's up to the DA's office. By this time, it's 2:30 in the morning, 3 o'clock in the morning. Come back about 2:30, 3 o'clock. So he said, well, listen, got some bad news for you. Prosecutor said, no, we're gonna hold you. You know what I mean, hold you. So now the bottom drops out and you spiral and you're trying to think, what do I do now? You know, all right, now I gotta get to a phone because now I need a lawyer. You know what I mean? Because this thing is getting out of control. So they put you back in what's known back then as the snake pit. And the 8th race had a holding cell where they hold about maybe 50, 60 people, all kinds of people. You know, you're in there with all kinds, you know, and it's crazy. And please don't have no money in your pockets, you know, because they're gonna rob you. You know, so I'm saying, well, I can't even make a phone call because I don't have, I got change, but I can't use the phone. And I got cash money in my pocket, but I can't pull out $1 or something and say, look, can you give me a couple quarters so I can make a phone call? So I called the sheriff to the door, and I said, well, listen, you know, I want to make a phone call. I want to call a lawyer. He said, all right, just hold on. I'll get back with you, young buck. Just hold on. Right now, we got to feed you. So by this time, it's like 5 in the morning. So I'm going to speed up this process. You know what I mean? Because I can extend it all the way out. They wind up transporting me from Race to the detention center on State Road. And back then, 1980, detention center was like something from the draconian era. People were sleeping on floors, rats was everywhere. Smell was just, would just knock you out, you know. I mean, it was crazy. You know, we were in a cell with maybe 60, 70 people. Cells only designed to hold about maybe 30. You move from that area to a bench. They got long benches. Back then they had long benches. And if you don't make it to a bench, you gotta sit on the floor. If you sit on the floor, the rat's gonna get you. The rats just run up and down, you know, so everybody trying to get to the benches. You know what I mean? From there, you go to the gym because there's no room in the jail. The jail was overcrowded back in 1980. So you have to go in the gym and you sleep more on the floor. And that's even worse because now guys is getting raped, you got rats, you got crazy people, everything. They steal your sneaks, steal your underwear, whatever you got. You know, it's this draconian. You go through that for about maybe, if you survive that, for about 30 days, they'll put you on a dorm. Dorm holds about maybe, at that time, maybe 150 people to a dorm, maybe 200. It's 25 per section, like 4 different sections. You go through that, and in my case, I had double felony. I had murder, robbery. So they had to separate me from, you know, the lesser cases. They separate the murder felonies from the lesser cases. Put the murder felonies on the blocks. There's units called blocks. Blocks hold about maybe 50 people. And yeah, you know, they put me on the block. And again, it's unreal, it's surreal, it's a different world. It's a totally different world. You cannot even comprehend how it is. You know, when you're inside one of them cells and the door go bang, boom, slam like that, you know, it just, you know, you don't believe it. you don't wake up like somebody like, honey, wake up. No. You wake up with the door, boom, and it rattles. You know, that's how you know how to get up to go. And if you don't step out the cell in a certain amount of time, the door closed back, so you won't go eat. You don't say go eat. You just door open. You just follow everybody. You come back, door closed. Again, I came to the prison system in the 80s, and it was like a gladiator type situation. It was real bad back then. You know what I mean? A lot of stabbings, a lot of killings, a lot of hangings, a lot of rapes, a lot of drugs, you know, by the grace of God, you know, I had people that knew me when I was little, you know, and they were already in there, so they was like, look, let me take you under my wing, let me show you what to do. You know, this is going to be your hangout from now on. You're going to hang out in the law library. That's going to be your hangout. Don't hang out in the hallways, don't hang out down the gym, don't hang out in the yard, hang out in the law library. Don't stay in the cell or stay on the block. You know. And for maybe 6 months I did that. And I took to it. I started liking it. And I remember the first case we was fighting was Jackson versus Hendricks, overcrowded conditions in the prison. And what's his name? Yeah, Dusty. Yeah, my man. He represented us. I can
Tell you're a lawyer, right?
Yeah, man. He represented us. You know what I mean? David Radowski, you know, he was like an archangel, you know, because they were very reluctant about seeing us as human beings. You don't, when you go inside of a prison system, the first thing they do is what's known as strip. So you lose your name, you lose your race, you lose your status, you're just a number. They call you by your number, you know what I mean? All the money, you know, that you may have or whatever, don't mean nothing in there. So they strip you of that. Then they degrade you as much as possible. You wear a size 32 pants, they're going to give you a pair of 36s. So you got to walk holding them up wherever you go. You got to walk home. Or they'll give you a tight shirt. Or they'll give you a pair of pants too tight. So people will look at you. You see what I'm saying? They're going to degrade you and see how much pressure you can take. You see, it's all about how much you can handle, how much you can handle. And so, again, I was keen enough to peep the guys, the strong guys, not just the guys, the gangster guys, not the guys that was walking around with knives and stuff like that. I'm talking about the guys that were smart with the brain, you know. They knew how to file a motion to stop a guard from doing what he was doing. We had a couple of guards in there, there were some real cool people. And we had some legal, what they call legal eagles, you know, and these guys would sit down and file briefs and motions and put a stop to it. And I was like, wow, I was fascinated about that. You know, to see a guard, you know, get transferred. How do you do that? You know, put it in the paper, you know, that's how you do it, you know. So I started studying the law, you know, started reading as much about it, and Marissa and any lawyer, I know a lot of y'all here know about the law. The law is like an ocean, you know. I mean, the more you study, the more it is, and it just fluctuates. The little word "and" can mean so much, so much. You know, I done took "and" all the way back to the 17th century, brought it all the way from the King's Bench. I swear I took "and" all the way back to the King's Bench and brought it all the way up. You know what I mean? Like, how did you flip this word "and" to fit, you know, to deny me, you know? And so, yeah, you know, you have to learn a lot of details. Again, it was all self-help. Guys would teach me, you know, I would file a motion or something to the best of my ability. And they would say, no, change that around, do this. And I made a lot of mistakes, but I kept pushing paper. You know, the courts was like, listen, we're tired of you. You know what I mean? You're messing it up. this is what we're talking about, and. When we say and these kind of petitions we are tired of. You know, guys are talking about, well, they don't sell peanut butter in commissaries, you know, and the courts was getting mad about that, you know, because they were grouping all our petitions together. So they came up with this scheme called the PCRA. And so we got something for y'all now. We're going to start putting real blocks and hurdles in front of y'all. And every time you make a mistake, you're going to really set yourself back till you burn yourself up till you can't get out. You see what I'm saying? So everybody started getting sharp and keen, like, wait a minute, I got one more shot at this thing. If I make a mistake, I can't appeal no more. You see what I'm saying? So it's a delicate process. It's a trial and error process. You know, I went through that for quite some time. And as I said, I was growing all the time. Went to trial, and by the time I went to trial, my trial lasted something like about maybe 6 months. But it was a 5-day trial. Imagine that, it was a 5-day trial, just 5 days. But my trial lasted 6 months. They would bring me down that Monday for a hearing in courtroom 259. That afternoon, I'd be in 617. So they bounced me around, moved me around, so my family couldn't even find me when I was going to court. And my family had to go to City Hall and pick up the phone and say, we're looking for the Granger case. Where's the Granger? And that's how much they was moving me around. Or else they would postpone it. If something else was going on that didn't fit right, they would just, all right, let's postpone this until we can retract and get this together and bring it back. The judge would say, bring it back in front of me because that's not right. He literally schooled the prosecutor. You know, no, you're going wrong. You know, case in which Marissa was talking about witnesses. In my case, we found out that investigating detectives had interviewed all 3 witnesses together in one room. In one room. All 3 of them. You know, so, you know, the judge was saying, well, this is not, you know, we can't allow this. I mean, you know, y'all got to go back and try to change it. So what they did is like what Marissa said, they took the lady who was the main key, because the lady saw who actually committed the crime. She actually saw it. She didn't see the crime, but she came up upon it when the crime was occurring. And so the prosecution saw that, so he excluded her. We don't want her, you know, because, you know, she'll come in and tell the truth. And they used the other 2 witnesses to manipulate and fabricate the case. You see what I'm saying? Even though one of the witnesses actually said, we find out later, the prosecutor said, do you see the person who committed the crime in the courtroom today? And he said, yes, Your Honor. He says, that person right there, Mr. Granger. Well, this guy that said that, we found out later that he couldn't identify when they showed him my picture. He said, no, that's not him. And this was the same day that the crime occurred. Showed him the picture, said, that the guy? He said, no, that's not him. We also found some other stuff that was going on with this guy. I mean, this guy was really dirty, you know, but aside from that, the prosecutorial misconduct was unbelievable, just totally unbelievable. And again, faced with that, they came to me, you know, with a deal. You got to understand, this time, I discovered newly discovered evidence. Let me retract. I discovered newly discovered evidence. They call it newly discovered. 26 years old, but it's newly discovered, right? And I discovered this evidence 26 years later. 26 years later. And the evidence of what they would call that, they had manipulated the case so sophisticated that they had twisted it up. The way, if you looked at my notes of testimony, they said, no, Kenny came in the bar Then he came back out the bar. He came in the bar again. He came back out the bar again. You know what I mean? And, you know, you're looking at it like, well, how could he possibly do all this and commit the crime? You know, and y'all giving the police 5 different descriptions of the perpetrator. 5 different descriptions. Not one of the descriptions was consistent. Not one. One said I was tall. One said I was short. One said I was light-skinned. One said I was dark-skinned. One said I had long hair. One said, no, he had a bush. One said, no, he had a tan hat on. You know what I mean? And all of this stuff is stuff. You know what I mean? They said, well, one of them got offended. You know what I mean? One of them, you know. So, seriously, it's, you know, because I raised the issue, like Marissa said, about identification. And I took it all the way back. And the courts were saying, well, you know, even though it may be vague, and even though they may have said different variations, it does not, I forget exactly what they were saying, but they were saying it does not discredit the witness's testimony, you know, one iota, you know, something like that. And I was so infuriated, you know what I mean? So when DNA came out, it was like a godsend. And DNA, it kind of revolutionized the criminal justice system, but at the same time, it put the criminal justice system on alert. You know what I mean? That, we can't get away with a lot of dirt now. Now we can't just, you know. So what Philadelphia did in particular, particularly Philadelphia, and I have notes and testimony in my house right now. I have cases that I will show you. They started destroying evidence, right? And they had a warehouse over here somewhere, 12th Street or somewhere. They had a warehouse over here. I don't know where it was. Yeah, somewhere around here. Big warehouse. They were storing all the evidence. And in City Hall, they had a lot of notes and files and stuff that was all in the hallways, all downstairs and the steps and everything. Well, those notes and those files was from cases from the 60s, 70s, and 80s that I had met these old heads up Bradford that were now trying to prove their innocence. Like Marissa was saying, guys that was down for rape, murder. Guy had 45 years at it. He was down for rape, murder. You know, he said, Kenny's, I'm trying to get the evidence so I can file a DNA, you know? He went straight in, like the court said, no, you gotta ask the DA for the evidence. DA looked at the case and said, oh my God, we get this guy's evidence, he innocent. You know what I mean? He gonna prove his innocence. He gonna sue us. So they just threw it in the trash and like, oh, we can't find it. We can't find it. And I'm telling you the honest to God truth because at that time I was sending my daughters down there. God had blessed me. I had 2, my daughters that grew older than me, and they were like very determined to prove their father's innocence. Very determined. And it was like, I remember I sent my one daughter to the Superior Court, but she had to get these papers, and I sent the other daughter to the record room. She had to get these papers from the record room. And the lady was saying, well, why do you want these records? Your father's not going to get out of jail. You know, and my daughter got upset and went to cuss the lady. I was like, listen, please, just calm down. My oldest daughter knew the judge in Superior Court, knew Fitzgerald, knew him so well. She was like, Dad, who is it, Fitzgerald? I was like, yes, it's Fitzgerald. Yes, it's Fitzgerald. You know what I mean? You know, but this is how, you know, dedicated and devoted, you know, that we were on this thing, you know, until finally we cracked it. And when I finally was blessed to crack it in 2006, it's something that you're not going to believe. You know, but all the time I had the evidence of my innocence right there in my cell. Right there in my cell. It was right in my notes of testimony. And I couldn't find it. I couldn't see it. I couldn't see it. And every day I would watch Crime Files and 60 Minutes and Perry Mason. I'm trying to find ways how to, and then one day I was watching Crime Files, and it was an old case, and the guy said, whenever you're dealing with an old case, look at the numbers. Look at the numbers. You know, start with the numbers. And like Marissa said, then you have to deconstruct. Stop looking at it in chunks. Deconstruct it. And so that's what I set out to do. I took my papers and put it out, and it started revealing stuff. It kept revealing more stuff. And I deconstruct and reconstruct. You know what I mean? All the way out until I had developed like a brief. Like a brief. So I couldn't believe it. I sent it to my children. I said, listen, y'all read this and tell me what do y'all think. And they was like, Dad, this is incredible. How did you find this? And I was like, I know. I don't know if you're going to believe it, though, but I know. It's incredible. I mean, I don't believe it, you know? And the baby girl, she said, well, this is what I'm going to do. And at that time, my baby daughter was competing for the Olympics. So she was on the international circuit. She was in Germany and doing the triple jump. And she said, no, I'm going to come back home because I want to help find you a lawyer. You need a lawyer. I'm going to come back. I said, no, go ahead on and compete. You know, everything is good. I said, my oldest daughter got it, everything is all right. She said, Dad, don't worry about it. You know, I'm going to come home for a minute. We're going to get the lawyer. And she was in Germany doing research on her computer to find me a lawyer in Germany. You know, this little young lady, man, you know, and she wouldn't stop. She wouldn't stop, and she found me. And so her and my oldest daughter went to the lawyer, and they presented what I had compiled. And when he read it, you know, it was like, wow, you know, we got to go see this guy. You know, we have to go see him. And so that's when the ball started bouncing. The Innocence Project was in this inception thing. And we decided to, because before we had, the Innocence Project had developed in Philadelphia, me and my children were working with the Innocence Project in New York. So we had an attorney from New York come all the way to Philadelphia. And he was working with us. And he wanted to look for, again, because in New York they deal with DNA specific. It's DNA. You know, back then we were like, no, we need the DNA. It's physical evidence in your case, we need to find it. So I said, well, all right. There was a hat that the perpetrator wore. If we could find the hat, we can get the DNA, you know, and that'll totally get it. So I told him, I said, listen, don't go in asking the DA for the hat. Don't do that. Because remember, the old time we got 45 years, they burned him up, you know, but he finally got out, he got commuted, but I said, this is what you do. Go to the evidence room and see if the evidence is there. I have the evidence number. So see if the evidence is there. If the evidence is there, then go to the DA. See how I'm saying? Then you go to it. So that way they can't get rid of it because you just went to the evidence room and they told you it's available. You see what I'm saying? So he didn't do it. He went and asked the DA. He said, Ken, we can't go that route. They have procedures, you know, I have to go and ask, you know. And when he did that, the hat disappeared. But I had the hat number. I still had the evidence number. You see what I'm saying? So, of course, we were a little disappointed. But he was saying, don't worry about nothing. I'm not going to give up. We're going to get you out. This was in 2007. So we're going to get you out. Don't worry about nothing. And we just kept fighting. I filed my own habeas corpus. Because the evidence that I had found was just that potent, just that powerful. I said, no, I'm going to the feds because the state going to try to burn me. You know, I'm going to the feds. And the feds going to oversee this whole thing all the way out. So I filed it to the feds, and this is my second hate. And the judge was like, Mr. Granger, we're telling you right now, if you got one word that's messed up in there, you burn, you're done. You're done. You know what I mean? So I was like, all right, so I don't know, God was with me. It was a clerk. She said, no, you got something wrong in here. I'm going to put a stop on it. I said, well, put a hole on the stop. Don't let it go through, please. You know what I mean? And at the same time, that same week, the Innocence Project contacted me. They said, listen, we're gonna take your case. So I said, all right, thank God, you know, thank God. Yeah. And so I said, well, listen, whatever you do, stop the hate. Please stop the hate. I said, because if it goes through, I won't be able to feel nothing. And so the dog-sleep baby and them said, don't worry about nothing. We got it, right? And, you know, me and my daughters, they just came up to see me and we just cried and everything. And they said, Dad, they took your case, they're working on your case and everything. And so I'm sitting in my cell. It's like 200 degrees in the cell, you know, and it's hot summertime and I'm still, you know, refining. You know, once you get on it, you don't stop until you do what's known as the judge in the United States Supreme Court says you do what's called a perfect brief. Yeah, it's only about 10 pages, but it's so powerful. That's what I wanted. I wanted to do something like about 10 pages, but it was so powerful they could not wiggle around it. No way. You know what I mean? And I had the stuff to do it, so I was just refining it. The guard came to my door. He said, you got a visit. This was on a Sunday. And I said, I got a visit. It was like 9 o'clock in the morning. I said, visit? He said, yeah, you got a special visit. He said, yeah, take this pass and go down to school. And I was like, to the school? You know, on a Sunday? Like, no, who's coming in here on a Sunday? You know. And I went down there, and I'm sitting there, and I seen a friend of mine, me and him started talking. And I knew it was something legal when I seen him. You know, and next thing I know, Marissa come in, and she got all these young college kids with her, you know? And she said, you must be Kenneth Granger. And I said, yes, I'm Kenneth Granger. Right? And she just grabbed me and hugged me like I was her son. You know what I mean? And I'm like, who is this woman? She just grabbed me. I was like, all right, okay, cool, all right. Just, you know, and she was like, listen, I gotta talk to you. I was like, all right, you know, let's sit down and talk. You know, and I'm still looking in my mind like, who is this woman? Who is, you know, it's kind of weird, you know. 27 years in, come on, y'all. You know. And she just kept talking, and she said, listen, don't worry about nothing. All I can tell you is that you're coming home. She said, at this point right now, that's all I can tell you. You're coming home. And so I said, when? She said, very, very soon. Very soon. You know what I mean? And it was like surreal. You know, I couldn't believe it. You know, it was like somebody coming in and saying, all right, we're going to rescue you from this hostage situation. You know, you finally coming home. You know, I couldn't believe it. I said, maybe she playing some kind of game or something. I don't know. You know, maybe I don't know what's going on, because I don't know it. So I know my lawyer's a male. You know what I mean? So, you know, I don't know it. You know, so she said, I want to talk to you after I have my class. You know, and you and I will talk. I said, all right. And we sit down, we talk briefly. And again, she wouldn't tell me nothing. She wouldn't give me a lot of detail or anything like that. She just kept saying, you know, are you all right? You know, do you need anything? You know, I said, yes, I'm all right, I'm good. You know, I just want to know when I'm coming home. You know, that's all. So when all was said and done, I managed to go back to the block. And when I say the block, let me be specific, because a lot of y'all don't know. The block is a unit. It's real long. It's like, imagine walking from Chestnut Street to like Walnut Street. It's long. It's big, about that wide, almost, right? It holds 800 people. 800 people. And that was back in the 90s. Now it's doubled up. So that's 1,600 people. 1,600 people. So, you know, yeah, when I got back to the block, it was kind of, you know, daughters and find out what's going on. And it was a lot of chatter. You know, my daughter was saying this, my youngest daughter was saying that. They said, Dad, they want to get you out maybe sometime within the next week or two. My baby daughter was saying, no, Dad, we're going to fight. We're going to take it to the feds. And that's that. You know, because we done found this evidence. And we got something to blow the lid off of everything. So I was like, I don't know what to do. I'm torn. You know, I don't know. Mind you, at the same time, people are dropping like flies in this place. They're dropping like flies. A lot of people was in there dying, you know. And I said dying, I'm talking about from TB, AIDS, flesh-eating bacteria, cancer. Every day you turned around, they was putting a post up, somebody had died, or 2 people had died last night. You know what I mean? So I didn't know what to do. And I went and seen some of the elders. And I asked the elders, you know, I said, what should I do? You know, I mean, I explained the situation to them. They was like, well, listen, if you didn't have a family, can you? Yeah, you can stay back and rumble. You know, you got a family. You got a family out there. You got children out there waiting for you. You know, go home. Go home. You know, so I said, all right. You know, and that's what I did. I mean, the process began. The lawyer came in and talked to me, and it all happened real fast. You know, like, you know, one day they came up to visit me. 2 days later, I'm over here at the Criminal Justice Building. Same day, I was out in the street. Boom. In the street. And, I mean, it happens, you know, just that quick. So, again, another traumatic experience. I just did 28 plus years. And to be thrown out here into society after 28 and a half years, you've been surrounded by a wall for so long. I just kept seeing the sign say Market Street. Right? I said, I could make it home for me. I could walk. My daughters was like, Dad, you can't walk for me. I said, I could walk. I know Market Street. I know if I keep going that way, I'll get home. And she was like, no, you can't walk. You can't. We got a car. Don't worry. As a matter of fact, when I came out of the CJ at the Criminal Justice Building, I still had on state clothes. So the sheriff said, wait, you can't go out like that. You know, y'all got to go buy him some clothes. And so my lawyers and them, they all ran across the Macy's. Got me a shirt and pair of pants and a hat. And I came out.
That hat from
Yeah, right. Exactly. Yeah, not City Hall. Yeah, not that one. Different hat. You know what I mean? Exactly. You know, to speed things up, because I don't want to elongate it. You know, it's been a struggle. It's still a struggle. I struggle every day. Every day. Every minute. Every moment. It took me like quite some time to learn how to even use a phone. A lot of things I didn't know about, you know. But again, God has blessed me. You know, because a lot of good things have happened. A lot of good things. And thanks to Marissa and my legal team and supporters and stuff, I've been many places. I gave speeches at the Kimmel Center, I gave speech at the Pyramid Club, I gave speech at Eastern State Penitentiary. Yeah, just been around the circuit, just, you know, trying to enlighten people, let people know, listen, you know, everybody inside those places are not monsters and evil people. There's a lot of innocent people in there. A lot of innocent, you know, especially because they're illiterate. I had a friend, he was illiterate. He didn't know how to read or write. They made him sign, like Marissa said, they made him sign a confession. And he thought he was signing his release papers. He signed a confession. You know, he's still up there today, I guess, really dead, you know. You see a lot of that. I did a lot of good while I was in there. And I developed some programs for the innocent people. You know, I developed this program called the Victims of Injustice. And helped a lot of guys out. At that time, this was before the Innocence Project. We had Jim McCloskey from Centurion Ministries, and we had Northwestern, Northwestern Savannah, and them young kids came in. They were college students, so they was working with guys, helping people with the cases and stuff like that. Talked to a couple of politicians. Tried to get them in on the band. What's his name? He's still a Republican guy. He's a real good guy.
Oh, Greenleaf.
Greenleaf, yeah. He was a real good guy. He came in, talked to us, even went inside one of the cells and the door closed and he couldn't get out. I swear, they had to pry the door. Boom. They could drop it, pull the door to get him out. I think that reformed him. I think that changed him. And so, again, I think I said enough about what's going on. I'm just glad that I'm here to share this experience with y'all. Again, I'm struggling, but I'm making it. Thank God I'm making it. I'm not giving up. Every day is getting a little better. Sometimes it's up, sometimes it's down. But as long as I got supporters and helpers like Marissa and others in my corner, I'm all right. But guys like myself and others, we need people like y'all to help us. You know what I mean? And like Marissa said, maybe 1 out of every 10 in there is innocent. So, with that said, I'm gonna shut it down.
I'll try to be very brief because I know that I assume the folks have a lot of questions, and you probably want to hear more from Kenneth as to I will just mention, you can probably surmise this from the numbers that Marissa gave. The courts are relatively ineffective in pushing back against this kind of thing. We're not the bastions of justice that you might imagine us to be, or that you might hope that we are. The numbers kind of emphasize that. There are a lot of reasons for that. Two big things. One is the hyping of science and the elevation of science, forensic science, which is not science at all. I'm wondering about the trials that sticks out in my mind. I used to be a common police court judge for about 10 years in state court. And I had an arson trial that ran for about 4 weeks, which is very, very rare for. It was a bench trial where the person gave up the right to a jury and tried it just to me as the judge and the jury. And it's very rare to get a bench trial that goes that long, although most of the trials in common police court are bench trials where the person gives up the right to the jury, and there are a lot of reasons for that. And I think Kenneth said earlier, your trial was a bench trial when that didn't have a jury. But the main testimony in this arson case was I won't mention the name of the place. It was a guy who dealt with used auto parts in a kind of a junkyard, a auto part junkyard that burned down. Prosecution theory of the case was that it was done for the insurance policy. The forensic fire examiner came in and testified with very vivid illustrations. And one of the big things in my mind was, how the hell do you know? You got all this smoldering trash sitting around. How can you be sure that this was an arson as opposed to a fire that just burst out either an electrical system or spontaneous combustion? It was the middle of August, particularly hot August. And he showed these photos, and he said, well, the scorch patterns remove any doubt to a mathematical certainty, which is the mathematical language, that this was arson. And he showed me the photos, and he said, look at the floor, you'll see patterns of enhanced scorching that showed that this fire was started by an accelerant. And I looked at it, and each one of the enhanced scorching areas was underneath the window. And I asked him, do you know at the time of the fire if that window was open or closed? At the time that he showed the photos, the windows were broken, so I couldn't get much from that. And he said, well, I really don't know if the fires were open or closed. So I asked the DA if he could bring in the person who was the first fire investigator on the scene. And one of the things with a bench trial, you can do that. You can tell the DA, bring this person in. And that person came in, and I asked him, when you did the examination of the scene, were the windows open or closed? And he said, no, I really can't remember. And I said, well, if you don't know if they're open or closed, you can't rule out the fact that they were open. He said, no. And I said, well, the fact isn't it true that they were just as likely to have been open as closed, and since it was a hot August day and no air conditioning in there, they're not going to air condition this kind of facility. It's fair to assume they're open. He said, yeah, that's a fair assumption. So then I brought the fire examiner back and said, well, if the windows were open, there's a richer source of oxygen. Why wouldn't that attribute for the scorching on the floor underneath the windows? He looked at it and he said, well, that's not how fires work. I said, well, help me understand how fires work. I thought fires worked because they had a source of fuel and enough air and a certain temperature to burn. He said, well, that's basically how fires work. But you have to understand the forensic science. So I'm sitting there going, this guy's trying to explain fire to me, right? And I'm not exactly a co-managed man. I know fire. But anyhow, I had a reasonable doubt, and I put it to the guy. Ironically, I saw him on the street years or so later with his wife, and he came up to me and he thanked me for the trial. And I said to him, you know, his first name was Bruce, I won't tell you that much. And I said, you know, Bruce, to this day, I don't know if you were innocent or guilty. I do know that the evidence didn't prove you guilty. You had a reasonable doubt. For all I know, you may well have started that fire. And he said, no, Judge, you got to believe me, I didn't start the fire. And when he said that, despite what you hear on TV about the prisons are full of people who maintain their innocence or guilty, I've not found that to be true. And I've gone into prisons an awful lot. The people understand, you know, what the deal is. You do the crime, it's my job as a judge to determine whether or not you're guilty. It's their job to get over if they can. But I have not found situations where people persist in proclaiming their innocence after you find them guilty. And one quick conversation I'll tell you, and then this will kind of get off the track a little bit, but that'll make the point, I think, and delve in with this theory of innocence. It was a rape trial I had after I'd been on the bench for 5 or 6 years. It was a waiver trial. And the defendant brought in the prosecution's case was that this guy had been living with this woman, they broke up, he got pissed at her and said, okay, but before I leave, I'm going to get you one more time. He rapes her, on his way out he takes her money, and so he's charged with rape and robbery. For his defense, he gets on the stand and he said, yeah, I was living with her, I was sleeping with her, she was working during the day, I would bring in my main squeeze, this wasn't my main squeeze, I was just living with her. I'd bring my main squeeze in during the day, and we'd have sex, and this went on for many, many months. One day she came home early and she caught us in the bed, and she said, I'm going to fix you, and she yelled rape, and next thing you know, I was being arrested for rape. And his testimony was very believable. And I did something which I would not have done later on as I got more experience. He then had a woman come in and say, yeah, I was the girlfriend. It happened. We were in we were having sex in the bed. I'd been coming over to the apartment for 4 or 5 weeks when the person who owned the apartment, who was his other girlfriend, went to work. This time she came in, she caught us in the bed, and she said, I'm going to fix you. And I believed her, and I also believed the complaining witness. So the witnesses were sequestered so that the defendant's witness did not hear any of the main witness's testimony. So I had, as my own witness, I called the complaining witness back in. I asked her to describe in great detail what that apartment looked like. Gas stove, electric stove, was the freezer, did the refrigerator have a freezer? Was it on the side, was it on the top, was it on the bottom? Did you have a kitchen, kitchenette? Where was the TV? Do you have blinds? Do you have drapes? And then I excused her, and then I called the purported girlfriend who came in during the day back in. I asked her how many times she'd been in the apartment, and she cooked, and I said, help me with the layout of this apartment. Did you have a gas stove? And I knew it was electric. She said, yeah, it was a gas stove. When you were in there, were the blinds open? I knew that they didn't have blinds that draped. She said, so I called you, the blinds were open. I asked her where the TV was. Well, there wasn't any TV. And then I convicted him. I saw him, ironically, about 3 years later in prison. I didn't recognize him, but he came up to me in Graterford. And we had a little chat. He said, hey, man, you recognize me? I was the one you convicted of rape. And I said, yeah, you know, I said, look, it's been 3 years, the case is over with, I can't do anything now, but, and I obviously convicted you, I believed you were guilty, but tell me what the hell happened. And he said, yeah, man, I made the bitch, just like the prosecutor said. Then he goes, but I had you, didn't I? I had you going, man. I know I had you going. And I said, you did. He said, man, when that woman got off the witness stand, I turned to my judge and said, I am over. But then you did that shit and you brought her back in there, you know. I turned to my lawyer and I said, I am fucked. I said, well, so what was the deal with the witness you had? He said, man, I didn't even know that bitch, man. She was my brother's cousin's girlfriend, and I told her I'd fix up and take care of her with some bucks and things, and she came in and testified for me, and I told her what I was going to say. But I didn't expect you were going to run through this shit with the department the way you did. But we had a little chat, and but he didn't maintain his innocence at all, and that's an extreme example. But I say that only that in my 10 years on the bench in state court, 18 years worked down in criminal court, if a defendant, after I convicted the person at a bench trial or a jury convicted him, ever continued to assert their innocence, that really gave me some pause. And there was a case. I think I made a mistake. I convicted somebody of murder, of a conspiracy to rob a taxi driver. And I went home, and as I was driving home, I thought he was guilty, but this whole thing a reasonable doubt was messing with me. And I got home that night, and I finally told my wife, I said, I couldn't sleep. And she said, what's wrong? And I said, I think I just convicted an innocent man of murder. Thank God the attorney filed post-verdict motions, and the basis for that was that she never explained to her client that he could take the witness stand and testify in his own behalf. And she was arguing that it was ineffective assistance of counsel, which it would have been, because he did not testify. At that hearing, he did testify, and he told me what happened. I believed him, and I asked her after the hearing, her first name was Chris. I said, Chris, why didn't you put him on during the trial? He's totally credible. And she said, well, Judge, I started to, but the informant was a jailhouse snitch case. Was so unbelievable. I needed to. And besides, he had a real long record, and you're better than those judges with that. But I just didn't want to bring out the fact of his prior record. When somebody gets on the witness stand, the prior records don't usually come in. I would have found out about this guy's rap sheet, and it was long. And she said, I just didn't want that coming in, and I didn't think I had to. So I gave him a new trial. Circumstance a word. I saw him a year or so later in the elevator in City Hall. I was going in to get a marriage license. And again, I didn't recognize him, but he introduced me. It was before we had the criminal center we have now, and we were all in City Hall. And I said, he told me he had a new trial, and I said, I remember your case. I said, what happened? And he said, well, my second trial was with the jury, and I got acquitted. And I said, kind of the same thing. I said, look, man, I don't know if you're guilty or not, but you should have been acquitted based upon the strength of that evidence. And he didn't say that he was innocent, didn't say he was guilty, which leads me to think he probably was guilty, but I just don't know, and that's not the point. It's kind of irrelevant. The issue is whether or not I should have been convicted. A couple of things that I want to get into with the legal system, and then I do want to stop for questions. One of the things that causes us to screw up so badly here is this culture. It starts with the us versus them mentality, and it kind of goes from there that police and prosecutors have, good guys versus the bad guys. I heard a lecture a while ago, and listened to it, by Professor Sunshine, who studied in the United Kingdom, and he was over there to compare the way interrogation works in the United Kingdom versus the way interrogation works here, and it's totally different. There, for example, the police will question someone with an eye toward finding out what happened. They're not trying to build evidence to convict the person. They're trying to find out what happened. And if, during the case of the discussion, and that's what it is, a discussion, the inquiring officer starts focusing in on that person as initiative, as the perpetrator, if the supervisor's there, the supervisor will pull him out and say, look, man, this interrogation is going someplace it shouldn't be going. We're not here to convict this person, we're here to find out what happened. There does come a point when that changes and they focus in on the person to get evidence. But the initial inquiry with witnesses is just that, it's an information gathering scheme. They cannot, for example, develop ruses. They can't tell the person, well, look, your buddy just dimed you out. Your buddy just put you in there and said you were the shooter. So you need to tell us, if you weren't the shooter, if it was really him, you need to tell him. Then they'll go to the other guy and say, he just said you were the shooter, so if it was, they'll go back and forth with that. They can say things like, look, we found your DNA at the scene, so you better tell us what's wrong. You cannot do that in the UK. Here, the Supreme Court has said there's absolutely nothing wrong with lying to the defendant in order to facilitate getting a confession. In the UK, that's forbidden. And one of the things that Professor Sunshine said the chief of inspectors in the UK told him, when the professor told him the way it's done here, he said, man, what is wrong with you people? You know, if we were to do that, and I was the suspect, I'm not sure that I wouldn't end up pleading guilty. We heard earlier about the percentage of guilty pleas that are later exonerated. And obviously there are a lot of guilty people who end up pleading guilty and who end up in prison. I'm not suggesting that there are. All I'm suggesting is that there's a real fundamental flaw in the way we view people accused of crime and the way we investigate them. Eyewitnesses we could spend the rest of the evening on, and I'm so glad Marissa did get into some of those slides because I was going to talk about some of them. One of the things that, and one of the things that we're trying to do with the Third Circuit with the task force that I pointed when I was chief, is to hopefully develop better jury instructions to inform jurors about the problems of eyewitness testimony, and to let them know just because the witness points to the guy and goes, that's him, doesn't mean you should accept that testimony. You should look at that with caution. Obviously, there's one person sitting in the witness table, at the defense table, and the DA asks, you see the person who robbed you in the witness stand, look around the room. Yeah, I will look around the room. They're going to pick the guy sitting at counsel table. A lot of that can be prevented with better identification processes. And there's some efforts made now by the federal law enforcement. Sally Yates, when she was Deputy Attorney General, put out a memo, which is now referred to as the January 27th memo, because the Department of Justice does not want the name Sally Yates used at all. So Sally's memo is now the January 27th memo. But we're trying to incorporate Sally's memo into a lot of the things that we tell jurors. And some of that is common sense. You don't put three eyewitnesses in a room together to question them. You question them separately so that one does not pollute the other. If you're going to show a photo spread, you tell the witness ahead of time that the person may or may not be in the photo spread. And you do not have to make an identification. We don't expect you to make an identification. We just want you to look at these pictures and tell us whether or not you recognize anyone as being the perpetrator. And if you do, we want to know how certain you are or how uncertain you are. And the other thing, and the biggest thing that I'm hoping we can put into practice, it's already being done by the federal law enforcement agencies, and I'm hoping the jurors can be informed that it's, quote, best practices, although that's a struggle, so that police will be informed they need to do this. And that's blinding. You don't have the same investigator who's the lead investigator. You don't have that person show the lineup. You don't have that person show the photo spread, because even if they're not trying to suggest which picture should be selected, there's a decent chance that they will. The most common sense example of that is pharmaceutical testing. Nobody in the right mind would suggest that pharmaceuticals should be tested before they're brought to market under a protocol where the lead inspector who knows which is the placebo and which is the drug administers the placebo. You don't do that because it's too easy to suggest to the subject which is the real drug and which is the placebo. The same thing should be true in photo spreads where someone's life may be taken. There are a couple of other things I could say, but I'll stop there and do one more quick thing. This came out of a story. We decide cases in conference, as you know, and three panels of three judges. Years ago, I had a sitting with a judge who's now deceased, one of my colleagues, and it was an ID. It was a federal habeas case where we're reviewing state convictions. And I won't get into that, but federal habeas review is a very, very poor way of reviewing criminal convictions because there's very little we can do because of the way the federal statute is structured. There's very little we can do. Even when we see things that we know are wrong or unjust, there's very little we can do. This was a case where it was an ID case, and my colleague told me of something that happened to him a few years ago when he was from Scranton. And a good buddy he'd known for 30 years came up to him on the corner and tell you his first name. And he said, "Joe, where in the hell were you? I sat in that restaurant for 2 hours waiting for you. You could have at least had the decency to call me and tell me you couldn't make it." And the judge looked at him and goes, "Was I at lunch with you?" And he said, "That's exactly right. You don't remember that I sat in your office and you made an appointment to have lunch with me, I'm sorry, we're starting in the street corner. You made an appointment to have lunch with me. I sat in that restaurant and you never showed up. And it was Thursday when we made the appointment." And Joe's response to him was, "Are you sure it was me that you talked to?" And he said, "Yes." And then Joe said, if I was on trial for murder, would you testify that I was the person on that street corner that you talked to and made the lunch appointment? And Joe said, never forget the response. The response was, I sure would, and you'd hang. And Joe said he hadn't seen that guy in 10 years. So, it was obviously somebody who looked like him. Let me stop there. So we nearly have time to see if there are any questions.
So we're coming close to time, but I do want to take some questions. So if anybody has a question, feel free to raise your hand. I'll bring the microphone over to you.
Thank you for coming in today. My question is two-part. One is, how have in recent years the rules for procedure, have they affected change in mistakes made in rules of civil and rules of criminal procedure by prosecutors? How has that changed with pulling innocence out? And the second part is that, actually I forgot the second part, but that's good enough.
The rules of criminal procedure have not changed in the last few years to the extent that you're talking about. And it was 1996, I guess. The Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act. Whenever you hear a statute that says something like Effective Death Penalty Act, watch out. But that is the statute by which Congress severely restricted our jurisdiction in terms of reviewing state court convictions. I think it's basically a denial of writ of habeas corpus insofar as state prisoners are concerned. And I've made that argument. I haven't been able to get much traction to it. But the writ of habeas corpus that's enshrined in the Constitution is really the federal. It's a federal writ for federal custody anyhow. So there's no constitutional right of habeas corpus in terms of reviewing a state confinement. It's only a federal confinement. So it's made it much harder for us to review state court convictions. We have to give great deference to the state courts.
We don't need a mic.
Okay.
All right, my name is Nate Szilard. Thanks for coming out. I work with RISE, which is the Mayor's Office of Reintegration Services, and we try to provide supportive services for returning citizens, people that have criminal backgrounds, that have problems finding employment, education, and other supporting situations that they might need. So I was trying to say that we would like to provide services if that would be helpful in your case.
Do you have a card?
Yes, I do.
Listen, I got a couple of people that I know that just came home. They were juvies.
Right, we work with a lot of those guys.
Right? So now they're in their 40s and 50s. They've been incarcerated like 30, 40 years. So yeah, they need a lot of help. A lot now. So I appreciate, you sharing that with me. By the way, when I first got out, I went down to RISE.
Right.
And the lady was interviewing me. And when I told her, because all I had was my article that I was innocent.
Right.
I showed her the news article. And she said, oh my God,
Right.
you did 28 years? Wait a minute. She left out the room and turned it into a circus act. And I got so humiliated, I just left. I was just like, give me the paper, I'm all right. Yeah, but I appreciate it. Any resources that you can
we
share with us, man.
Just moved over to
I know where y'all at, right?
we just moved to 1425 today. Arch, 1425 Arch.
Arch?
Today was our first day there, yeah.
Oh, congratulations.
Thanks.
Yeah, 'cause y'all was around here on
990 Spring Garden. We started out at
yeah. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Right.
They were on Spring Garden for a minute.
Oh, okay. All right.
So I'll pass you over, call you, give me a call, we try to work out.
Yeah, I need some resources. I need, because I got a couple guys that's just getting out that needs a lot of help, Yeah.
So the movie.
All right.
Okay, so at the beginning during your presentation, you kind of alluded to maybe like 3 categories of where people might be put in prison who were innocent, false testimony kind of thing, just like mistaken memory and things, or scientific advancements, or just wrong science that was used. But then also something like what you were saying was like maybe prosecutors or police officers kind of putting their thumb on the scale kind of thing, trying to put people away. And I think that you kind of alluded to that when you're saying it's a very us versus them kind of mentality. Could you guys go into a little bit more, maybe like what are the pressures behind that maybe would cause like police officers or DAs or something like that to pursue a case that maybe didn't look like the evidence was presently there to say that this person was guilty.
I think I have a more charitable view than the judge, so maybe I'll start on that. I think the main problem is that prosecutors and police are human beings. And when they're looking at evidence or information through any particular lens, we all tend to look at it from a lens that will confirm what we already believe. And social scientists call that confirmation bias. So if they think that the person's guilty, then all the evidence that kind of comes in, they look at through that lens. So like in Kenneth's case, the eyewitness who didn't identify Kenneth, to me the prosecutor's like, well, he wasn't in a good position to view it anyway, right? They kind of rationalize it away. But then I've got a case that's out in Allegheny County. My client was convicted of an arson. The only evidence against him were two witnesses who testified against him, one who claimed that he had confessed to him and one who had testified that he saw him standing outside before the fire trucks got there, which defeated his alibi. And when they were asked at trial, are you expecting any benefit? Do you expect any? No, the goodness of my heart, blah, blah, blah. 10 years later, we find out that those two witnesses had been paid. One got $10,000, one got $5,000 from the federal government a year after the trial. Now, just paying them after the trial, that's not a crime. That's not a problem, necessarily. And in fact, the DA says, oh, well, yeah, they're very happy and surprised to get the money. When we went to go back to talk to them, they said, yeah, we knew we were getting the money. In fact, the one guy said he was only 15 when he testified, and he said, well, I thought I was going to get 15,000. I was kind of smoked when I got 10. And I said, so why did you say that you weren't getting anything? He said, well, as I was being walked into trial, the ATF agent said, now remember, I didn't promise you anything. So if they ask if you were promised, you say no. So he coached him on the testimony about that, right? So, why did he do that? Either he's evil or because he, very firmly believed my client committed the crime, and was really just trying to kind of push that along a little bit.
I do agree with that. I think they do it because they believe we got the right guy, and it's us versus them in that sense, and we got to make sure we nail this guy. He doesn't walk. He doesn't get away with it. But it's very easy for that to kind of bleed into a kind of pathology, which makes the person really, really dangerous in terms of their job vis-a-vis society and the justice system. If they don't take a step back to recognize what they're doing, and it's difficult to get them to take that step back and recognize what they're doing. I do think it's almost like shooter's bias. It's subliminally, it's something that's within people. There's a lot of research in terms of subliminal racism and shooter's bias, and anybody who's read the studies, not the least a bit surprised that black males get shot by cops at a ridiculously high rate. When police are confronted with that subliminal bias, they do take steps to try to neutralize it. Now, none of the studies that I'm aware of measure how far out that mitigation effect lasts, but it is immediate, right. And they can deal with it once they're aware that they have it. It may be that if police departments took steps to sensitize investigators and police officers and prosecutors to what they're doing, the harm that they're doing with this attitude, it may have an ameliorative effect. I would like to think with a large majority of people that it would, because they're causing more harm than good. You heard the numbers of crimes that were committed after the wrong person was locked up.
We have time for one more question.
Can I say something to that real quick? I just want to say a lot of it is them wanting to win the case as well, and not wanting to.
That's the culture that the judge is talking about.
I was wondering if you could talk about what you think the role that detainers and high bail play in pleas and in guilty people being sent to jail.
That's a problem that's really unique to the state system and the federal system. I mean, ironically, the client that I was just talking about who had been convicted of murder, they're now retrying him, but in the federal system, he's out on bail. Whereas if he was still in the state system, he would be on bail. We know that high bails lead to high recidivism issues because people lose their jobs and they lose their families, and there's been a great study by the Quattrone Center very recently on that issue. So we know that it leads directly to mass incarceration, no question about that. We also know that high bails lead to guilty pleas of people who are innocent who just want out. And we know that that's an issue. The question is quantifying that. I have no idea. right? I mean, even in New Orleans, where it's a meet and plead system, and people have extraordinarily high bails, they can't get out, they're on these horrific conditions, and it's just about getting home. And we know that there's an astronomically high plea rate, but because there's no way to kind of track those cases back to prove innocence eventually, we will never know. I mean, I can say that anecdotally, I feel very confident saying the plays an incredibly high rate issue, both in terms of mass incarceration and in terms of people pleading to crimes they absolutely did not commit.
Thank you so much to everybody for joining us tonight, and thank you to our speakers. And have a good night.